The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
The election of Barack Obama marked a turning point in American politics. Or did it? Obama won 53% of the popular vote, captured 365 votes in the Electoral College, and attained a higher percentage of white votes than any Democrat since Lyndon Johnson. The Republicans lost at least 7 seats in the Senate and 21 in the House of Representatives. Did the polls accurately predict the nature and extent of the Democrats' victory? How decisive was the support Obama received from African Americans and Latinos? And what do the polls tell us about whether the Republicans can come back from this electoral defeat? Here to explore these issues is Karlyn Bowman, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Karlyn Bowman, welcome to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
Thank you so much.
We're delighted to have you here. Now, you watch polls for a living.
I do indeed.
So I've always wanted to ask, what's a poll?
A poll is a sample of the American people. George Gallup used to say that you're as likely to be polled as you are to be struck by lightning. We're a big country, and most of the surveys that you see in the newspapers sample about 1,500 people.
Wait. 1,500 out of 300 million?
1,500 out of 300 million, and
Wow.
Statistically, this can give you a sample of what America looks like.
Incredible. Now, we do this for all sorts of things, from automobiles to presidential elections.
We do. It spans the gamut of just a wide variety of things. A huge amount of the work goes on in market research for companies like Procter & Gamble, testing the products you and I would like, and of course, that works in the political world too.
This big industry, excuse me, I'm getting a little bit of a cold.
It's a very big industry, Doug. As a matter of fact, we're not exactly sure how big it is. You can hang out a shingle and say you're a pollster these days, and so a great many people are involved. And we certainly saw that in this last campaign because there were more people polling than ever before.
I gather, I don't know whether the news coverage changed or whatever, but I remember in the past it was this poll or that poll, and this time around it was like the poll of polls, and it was an average poll and so forth.
I think reporters covering the campaign found it easier to look at the average of the polls or the poll of polls because there were so many polls coming out, and some days you'd have 4 or 5, 6 polls, 6 major polls coming out in a day.
Wow.
And it's hard to cover all those, so I think that they found it easier to cover the averages.
So this is probably an unfair question, but you know, amateurs always like, so was one pollster better than, or were some pollsters better than all the others?
Well, there were a lot of pollsters in the field this time, as I said earlier, and most of them did pretty well. 2 very different kinds of pollsters, Pew and Rasmussen, called the race on the nose. They do things very differently, but they both predicted the race.
Now, the difficulty in these polls is it's not just, well, who do you like better? The trick is to figure out whether the person you're interviewing is going to vote. Is that right?
Absolutely. That's one of the most difficult things that the pollsters have to do in an election year. And so over the course of the election campaign, they not only ask you, well, do you plan to vote on election day, but they ask you a lot of other follow-up questions to see how serious you really are. Do you know where your polling place is? Did you vote in the last election? What do you think of the candidates running? How interested have you been in the campaign? Because, of course, all of us give the civically correct response. We say that we're going to turn out to vote, and that's admirable.
Wow. Now, we talk about polls, and in this program I'd like to talk to you about what happened in the election, but we learn a lot more from the exit polls as well. What's an exit poll?
An exit poll is a poll conducted of, a poll conducted of voters leaving the polls.
Just as you're leaving the building.
Just as you're leaving the polling place, a computer spits out precincts all over the country where exit pollster interviewers go, and they hand every nth person a paper ballot with questions on both the front and the back, and that gives them basic information about the demographics of the electorate and about the attitudes and the positions of people who actually voted. Exit polls are important because they're the one sample that we have of people who actually voted. And this year we had the major consortium of all the networks plus the Associated Press, the 5 major networks and the Associated Press conducted an exit poll. And of course the Associated Press, working side by side, is actually capturing raw vote totals and actual vote totals in the states along with the exit polls.
So there's essentially one exit poll that everyone uses.
There was in this case one exit poll. In the past there have been more than one.
In 2000, I think it was, there was some criticism that the exit polls both were not accurate and that they came out so early that they affected the race. What was that all about?
Well, that was one of the many controversies about exit polls. The pollsters have agreed not to broadcast the results of the exit polls in any state until the polls in that state have closed. But throughout the day, they characterize the race, and so you basically have an idea of which way the race is going overall. So that contributed to the controversy in 2000. But there were some other problems that year. There was a simple mechanical error, a data entry that was backwards that affected the results in a particularly key county, and they found that some of the interviewers that they were using, that a lot of people didn't take the exit poll ballot. Older people didn't want to take the ballot, and so that skewed the results in some ways, and more Democrats took the ballot than Republicans, and that's a problem that the exit pollsters need to worry about in the future.
So what you're hinting at when you said about the earlier results, I take it that in the normal year, people know very early on in the day how the election has gone.
If it's a big election, you usually have a pretty good idea from the exit polls pretty early in the afternoon what's actually happening, yes.
So am I wrong to say when I was watching TV and I saw the commentator saying, well, McCain will have to work hard to overcome this? Was that the way of saying there's a big number in the other direction?
Well, that was a way of characterizing the race and giving you some hints of what might be happening when they actually broadcast the results in the evening.
It's a very tricky question, of course, because they don't announce the results in New York until New York has voted. But New York and Florida and so forth have voted long before California closes.
That's right.
And so it must have some impact. I'm not asking, what do people think? Do they think it has an impact on the states that haven't closed yet?
I think to the extent Americans have thought about it, I think they worry a great deal about that. The academic evidence seems to suggest that as many people are deterred as are brought to the polls by what they hear in terms of news reports overall. But it's certainly something that people worry about. Of course, we are a vast and a different country, and people in California have a particular personality in voting, and Florida another personality, so it doesn't necessarily tell you what's going to happen if you hear East Coast results.
Well, we should talk a little bit about the election. So what happened to John McCain?
John McCain had a very, very tough road from the very beginning of the campaign. We knew that in January, looking at the early public opinion polls. A very negative verdict on the Bush presidency made it hard for any Republican. One particular indicator that I look at the beginning of every election year is what the country says in terms of the division between Republicans and Democrats. And in 2000, the country was at perfect partisan parity. In 2004, we were at partisan parity. But if you looked at those numbers at the beginning of 2008, the Democrats had a very substantial advantage over the Republicans. So they had a structural advantage based on party identification. They had a big advantage in terms of the enthusiasm once Obama was the nominee. They had a big money advantage overall. They've done an excellent job of recruiting in terms of the the House and the Senate candidates overall. And so that's what happened to McCain. It was a very tough year for a Republican.
And what's your judgment of Palin? Net plus, net negative?
She certainly energized the base, and that was important for McCain going into the fall because I think in many ways the Democrats had such significant advantages overall. Some people expected that she would draw independent women to the Republican ticket. There's not a great deal of evidence of that. Her negatives rose very sharply during the campaign, much as Hillary Clinton's negatives had risen during the campaign and actually during her long career in politics.
It always seemed to me that the Palin situation was difficult to judge because without her, you called it energizing the base, without it, McCain might not have gotten his 40-whatever% of the vote.
It's possible.
And then the complaint is always, well, she didn't help him with the last 5. And someone else might have gotten him the last 5, but that someone else might not have gotten him the first 44 or whatever
Exactly. You can make that case in a number of different ways.
But we've so that's McCain, but then of course there's this 700 million, no, what is it? How much did he raise? $600 million?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a big number.
A very big number.
Yeah. So it's a juggernaut in some respects.
Yeah, the fundraising advantage was also something very difficult for McCain to begin to overcome. I mean, it's hard to be competitive when your opponent has that much money and is able to spend it in so many ways with staff, or with field staff in state after state, running a 50-state campaign, which many people thought was a pretty bold gesture overall, but in the final analysis worked for Barack Obama. So yes, he had a lot of resources that the money brought.
Also something a little sneaky, I thought. Since McCain didn't have as much money, a higher percentage of his ads were negative. I don't know what the count is. A very large number of Obama ads were negative, but the percentage of his total ads. So he was able to show up as, well, a small percentage of my ads are negative when they really pounded McCain.
Yeah. In fact, in public opinion polls, Americans said that the McCain ads were more negative than the Obama ads. So that was clearly the widespread perception in the electorate.
So what's the Obama coalition?
Obama did extraordinarily well in this election overall, the first Democrat in a long time to get more than 51% of the vote.
Let me interrupt. And we should say that his vote percentage was the same for the general population. It's the white vote. Before we go into subgroups, he did carry the country.
Yes, he did. It was a clear victory, and I think that was very important to the American people after having had two very close elections overall. He did better with most groups than John Kerry and Al Gore had done before him, but he did exceptionally well with a few groups. African Americans, their share of the electorate rose 2 percentage points. That doesn't seem like very much, but in a slow-growing population, that is a very impressive advantage.
From around 11% to around 13%.
That's right, and he won about more than 95% of that vote, so that was an extraordinary accomplishment overall. He did very well with young people, much better than John Kerry or Al Gore before him. Again, very, very impressive overall. Young people were a small share of the electorate, but with that kind of a margin over John McCain, that was an important part of the coalition. But in group after group, we saw him do well and do better than his predecessors.
Let's take a few of these groups and talk about them. African Americans, I mean, in the primary for a while, it looked as if Hillary Clinton was going to get a significant share of the black vote. In the general, I guess there was never a question. Is there any inkling in the polls that the Republicans can ever get the black vote back?
It's going to be very, very difficult. The one possible ray of hope for the Republicans is if you look at 18 to 29-year-old African Americans, they're less likely to identify as Democrats, but not necessarily more likely to identify as Republicans. They've moved into the independent camp, which suggests that at some point they may be up for grabs, but it's a very, very long and difficult struggle, I think, for Republicans.
Especially, you mentioned about young people. Young people do seem to be more likely to call themselves even liberal. I was quite surprised to see that. And they do seem to have turned away from the Republican Party as a party.
Young people have turned away from the Republican Party in very significant numbers. So if the Obama presidency is successful, I think he has an opportunity to cement a generational allegiance, just as Ronald Reagan did before him and Franklin Roosevelt before that. Those are the two other distinctive generations in our politics, and it's possible that Obama will have an opportunity to create another.
Now, not to disparage our young people, is this because of some attitudes they have, or because they like the cool candidate?
Yeah. Well, I think it's part of the cool candidate, but young people are the most oriented toward change. They voted for the Republicans in 1994, for the Newt Gingrich Republicans. They want action. They want the candidate who's going to move ahead. And so certainly I think Barack Obama looked like that candidate overall. On many issues they are more liberal than their older brothers and sisters and their parents. And so that's probably contributed to their movement to the Democratic Party.
What does liberal mean? Does it mean our traditional concept of liberal, big government, or does it mean more tolerance, acceptance of differences?
I think a lot of it is tolerance and acceptance of differences. Certainly if you look at attitudes toward gay marriage, toward gay rights in general, young people the most tolerant, the most accepting, the most likely to know someone who's gay. The one issue exception, if you look at young people's attitudes, is abortion, where they're actually a little bit more conservative than their older brothers and sisters. There's a lot of speculation. Some people have suggested they've seen a sonogram of their younger brothers and sisters. Again, I really don't know, but it's the one area where Gallup and others have reported a slight conservatizing influence.
Yeah, I've always thought it was also partly young people like to be against whatever it is, you know.
There's some of that, yeah.
I think this is a long-term problem for the Republicans. They the public image seems so square. It's hard to see how you energize these young people.
Well, issues are important, candidates are important. If you look at some of the B team for the Republicans, the Bobby Jindals, you know, there's a very impressive group of younger Republicans who, if they're able to move to the forefront, could bring those young people back. As I said, they're very change-oriented, they're very action-oriented, and it could be that a Bobby Jindal seems more appealing to them than another Democrat.
Fair enough. We should say Bobby Jindal is
the governor of Louisiana.
Young people, though, I think it's the case, for all the talk, the turnout wasn't much higher.
That's right. That was one of the expectations that was dashed in this election campaign. We expected them to turn out in huge numbers. In fact, they did turn out in higher numbers than in the past, but just not in the exceptional numbers that people expected.
And I think the two other groups I want to talk about, Latinos and elders, seniors. The Latinos, now that was a group that for a while was up for grabs.
It certainly was. George Bush had shown some strength with Hispanics, with Latino Americans, certainly in the 2000 campaign and then again in 2004. But John McCain, despite the fact that he had a policy on immigration that many of them probably liked, was not able to overcome the kind of magnetism that Barack Obama had for this particular group.
Boy, you take the PR approach. I think it's fair to say that if McCain wasn't all the way out there, he was almost as far out there on abortion, on immigration reform as any Democrat. And yet the Democrats were able to picture this as the Republicans being against.
Well, there were a lot of Republicans on the other side, and so they just painted the brush with very broad strokes.
And the other large group where turnout is quite large are the seniors.
That's right.
They voted for George Bush in 2000 and 2004, I think. What did they do this time?
They were less democratic than other groups overall. Age tends to, there's some of the conservatizing influences of age.
Yeah.
So.
You think that's what it is?
Could be, could be.
Now you mentioned about the young people, and I guess I want to ask you about whether there's the proverbial new majority being formed, and of course the Republicans thought that happened in '94. But if you looked at that election, you could see it was again. There were parts of the country that just weren't moving. When you look at this most recent election, many parts of the country that hadn't been Democratic for decades seem to have turned, and almost seem to have turned for good. There are very high percentages in places. What's your thinking? What's the field's thinking about what the present state is?
I think it's premature to say that there is an emerging Democratic majority. We'll have more evidence of that in 2010 and 2012, but there's certainly some indicators that point strongly in that direction. The growth of the Hispanic population and their growing electoral clout, that will be very important. The growing number of singles who are also oriented to the Democratic Party, the growing number of people with a postgraduate education, a very solidly Democratic group overall. So there are a number of groups that are moving in the Democratic direction, and you're absolutely right about the map. In this election, we saw a lot of changes in the center of the country that look very much like Republican strongholds, and so the Republicans have a lot of repair work to do.
I'm struck, though, that the examples you gave tended to be demographic more than ideological.
That's right.
Why is that?
Well, that's what I tend to look at in terms of shifting electoral coalitions, whether or not we're actually seeing any kind of a realignment in American politics. I look at the demographic shifts. They're not everything. Demography isn't destiny, the old adage goes. Issues are important, candidates are important, the times are important, the mood is important. But if you look at demographic groups that are lopsidedly favoring one party or the other, and if they're moving in significant directions, then I think it tells you that something is happening in the country.
Yeah. There's this curious anomaly as I look at it. When pollsters ask Americans whether they're liberal or conservative, it may just be the liberal's not a very popular word, but that polls way under 20% of the country.
That's right.
Conservative polls are way over 20%, then there are, I guess, moderates or whatever. And yet the party affiliation doesn't reflect that higher number of conservatives.
Yeah.
Can you explain that?
I think that we're a Democratic-leaning country, but still a centrist country and a center-right country in some particular ways. A lot of analysts looking at this election said, well, we're not a center-right country anymore. We've become a center-left country anymore. I think the judgment's not out on that. But you still have most Americans calling themselves moderates, about 45%, and of the remainder, as you correctly said, about 35% are usually conservatives and about 18 to 20% are usually liberals. And that's been true for quite a while.
Why did you say we were a Democratic-leaning country? What does that mean?
Well, in part it reflects, I think, Obama's victory right now in some of the movement among demographic groups. It looks like it could have a permanent cast. And we're more Democratic than Republican in terms of our party identification, and we're more conservative than liberal in our ideological identifications. Both things are true.
So
politicians have to govern from the center.
I was going to say, that's my next question. Tell me what that means, and what do these polls predict? What do the polls predict, assuming that Obama looks at polls and his people, about how he governs?
I think he knows he needs to govern from the center, and I think we've already seen some evidence of that. The center may have shifted a little in one direction or the other, but if you look at his choices, for example, for the cabinet, a lot of continuity, some very big names that are thought to be centrists. His education secretary selected this week seems to be in the reform wing of the education community.
But with a foot in both camps.
A foot in both camps, absolutely, that's true. But I think he's been very careful in his appointments, and I think the care that he's taken reflects the sort of bifurcated nature of a democratic country and a conservative, more conservative than liberal country.
No. We always, when we want to, we criticize politicians for not following the will of the people. And then we criticize politicians for watching the polls and following the will of the people. And so I suppose the question is, how does a politician lead in this time of polls where there's instant polling?
I think he should use polls to understand this very complex and heterogeneous country. He should not use them to make policy. They're too crude an instrument for that. They're too blunt an instrument for that. But they can give him a sense of where the country is. And you're absolutely correct. Most presidents or their advisors do pay a great deal of attention to the polls. I'm sure they're looking at attitudes toward the bailout, attitudes toward the rescue plan, what Americans are saying about the economy these days. But I don't think the polls should ever be used to make policy.
You kind of want the politicians to try to persuade us of something. Can you think of, this is a question out of the blue, I apologize, but examples of where the poles have shifted because a politician has persuaded the American people of something to change? Sorry to sneak that in.
No, that's all right. I think, you know, just as a broad general example, we're always skeptical about sending our soldiers into harm's way. The case has to be made to the American people, and correctly or incorrectly, that case was made. And so Americans were persuaded of what they felt before the Iraq War. Bill Clinton believed, George W. Bush believed, but they have to be brought along about that very, very difficult decision to go to war. They usually want Congress, they always want Congress involved. They prefer to act with our allies when it's possible, but they thought we'd done enough as far as going as far as we could with the allies and with the United Nations overall. So they had to be brought into that decision to go to war, and that's extremely important. I'm sure there are other examples that are probably more,
that's a good one.
Yeah, more closely related to your question, but that's an idea.
No, and it's striking because just to put a coda on what you said, I think the polls showed the American people in favor of the war in Vietnam until President Johnson said he was pulling out. So, and I hope our politicians, for better or for worse, try to do that kind of leading for us.
I do think they try to lead. I really do. That's what their job is.
Well, that's good to hear from a pollster. Karlyn Bowman, thank you so much for being with us here at the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
Thank you so much.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.